Hey guys, it's Courtney, and today we're going to be creating two very simple cards using the flower petal cover plate as well as the flower center cover plate. I'm also going to be using the friend stamp set along with the coordinating die and the circle thin frames, which are huge, by the way. You can use these for an A2 size card and even a 5x7 card. So I went ahead and used the two cover plates to cut out two panels here, both from Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock. And you can see the centers or the little cutout pieces from both of these dies pop out really, really easily. And normally I would just probably toss these or perhaps even use some of these elements for shaker bits for a shaker card. But in this case, I figured we may as well use them. So we're going to be creating two cards today. So I poked out all of these little centers of the flowers, and I'm going to keep these as well. Again, if you don't want to make two cards right now, save these because these make great shaker pieces. So for the first card, and for the second card actually, we're going to be doing some ink blending, and we're going to be doing these very, very similar, or with the same colors, I should say. So I'm going to take the panel that was the flower centers, and there's some stitching on here, and I know it's hard to see on camera, but it's basically the stitched outline of the flowers. So I'm bringing out some Distress Oxides here. I am using Abandoned Coral, Carved Pumpkin, Picked Raspberry, Seedless Preserves, and Dusty Concord. And I'm just going to kind of go in order. I went in that order, and for this particular panel, I'm not overly concerned with the colors having a perfect blend. This is going to be behind the other panel, so you're really only going to see little bits and pieces of it. I did kind of make sure that I had a kind of an even flow, I guess you could say, with the colors, but as far as the blending, it certainly doesn't have to be perfect for this panel. So here I'm on the Seedless Preserves, and I'm going to finish off with the Dusty Concord, and then I can put this panel aside to give it a couple of seconds to dry before I add any adhesive to it. So next I'm going to bring out another panel, and this is just a plain piece of Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock. Once again, I didn't use the die for this one, but I'm going to be doing my ink blending on this one as well, and I'm going to do it the same way. But this time I really want to get a good blend. So for me, what works well for me, I'm using a blending brush here, but I'm basically just putting down my color to kind of get my spacing correct. And then once I finish off with that Dusty Concord, which is that last color, I'm going to move in the opposite direction. And this is when I'm really concerned about the colors blending together. And I'm only working on two colors at a time. Once I get those to blend, then I can move on to the next color and get that to blend. So I made sure that the Dusty Concord and Seedless Preserves had a good blend to them. Then I'll bring in the Picked Raspberry and make sure that blends well with the Seedless Preserves, then the Carved Pumpkin, and all the way back up to that Abandoned Coral. Once I am happy with the blend, once again, I am going to put this panel aside to dry. This will be for the second card. So moving back to the first card that used the two cover plates, I am going to go ahead and adhere these all together. Now, couple of ways that you can do this. Well, actually, probably two ways that you can do this. So you can use a double-sided adhesive before running this through your die cutting machine, which is the easiest way. You don't have to worry about putting glue everywhere, but I don't have any, and I love using wet glue because I can never, ever, ever line anything up correctly the first time, and this gives me some time to get it right. So I added the adhesive around the edges of the card panel and kind of in between most of those flowers, or flower centers, I should say, to make sure that everything lays flat. I'm going to do the same thing with this next panel, and you can see that there's a lot of open space on this one, even more open space. So I'm going to put the adhesive around all four sides, but I'm also putting little dots here and there between the flowers, again, just to make sure that this lays flat. Super easy to line up because you have that stitching on the flower centers cover plate to line it up perfectly. So for my sentiment, I am going to go ahead and use the Friend Honey Cuts, which has 3 pieces to it. So it has the word and 2 shadow pieces. So I'm going to use all 3 on this particular card, but I didn't want to pull out any colored cardstock because honestly, I have a ton of it, but I rarely use it. I'd rather make my own colored cardstock. So I'm going to take out a piece of white cardstock here and pull out the seedless preserves. And I'm just going to add some color to this panel here. And this is what I'm going to use to go ahead and die cut the largest shadow as well as the word. And then the smaller shadow will remain white. So went ahead and die cut all of these pieces, ran that through my Gemini, and that way it looks like I have colored cardstock to match my background, even though it's just the same ink. So I went ahead and adhered everything together. I did have to add a little bit more ink to that largest shadow piece just because I must have shifted. I didn't bother to tape it down, but no big deal. You do want to make sure that your Distress ink or Distress Oxide ink isn't really extremely wet before adhering it together, because your glue is just not going to stick the way you want it to if your panel or if your cardstock is really soaking wet with that Distress Oxide. So I adhered the small shadow to the large shadow, and then obviously the word. There is the dot on the eye. So be careful when you're running this through your Gemini or your die cutting machine that you don't lose that little dot, because I've done it plenty of times, and instead of just running it through again, I spent a half an hour searching for this little dot. I can never find it, and I have to end up die cutting it anyway. So just be sure that you grab that little dot for the eye. I went ahead and adhered this down again using my Tombow Mono Multi Glue right there onto my card panel. And then to finish off the sentiment, I am going to use one of the sentiments from the Friend stamp set. And I stamped that onto a piece of white cardstock using that same seedless preserve so that it matches everything nicely. Trim this down to a sentiment strip and pop that up with some foam tape right there above my large Friend word. Now to finish this off, I ended up adding White Blizzard Nuvo drops, which are clear but very, very sparkly. And I added that to the center of all of the flowers just to add a little bit more dimension and a little bit more sparkle. And that is it for card number 1. For the second card, I am going to use the circle thin frames, but I'm only really going to end up using one of them, but you can see that this is huge. So I went ahead and ran this through my Gemini, again, using some Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock. You can use any cardstock here, colored cardstock, pattern paper, mirror cardstock would look great, but I'm going to save all of these pieces because I will use these for other cards and there's no sense of wasting this all, but I really only ended up using just one of the circles. I was going to use 2, but it just didn't look right. So I ended up just using the one of the smaller ones, and this is just going to kind of act as my background. I did end up trimming down my panel just a little bit, and I put this onto my card base just to kind of see how it would look with that white border, and I just took a tiny bit off of all 4 sides, adhered this down to my white card base, again using that Tombow Mono Multi Glue. That way I have just a little bit of that white poking through the sides, and this will kind of really frame everything in. So now I'm going to bring out the flowers, the leftover flowers, I should say, that I poked through from that cover plate die. And I'm going to arrange these on the lower left-hand side of this little frame. But they didn't look right leaving these white. So I'm going to color these. I'm not going to do any shading to them, but I'm pulling out some Copic markers that sort of kind of match the ink colors that I used in the background. Like I said, you can leave these white, you can use the Distress inks, but I just didn't feel like getting too inky. So I just pulled out some colors that matched. So this one is a RV17, and I figured this kind of matches the seedless preserves a little bit. I also brought out a V04 to match the Dusty Concord. I brought out a YR07 to match the Carved Pumpkin, and then finally I brought out an R35 to match the Abandoned Coral. Didn't really have anything to match the Picked Raspberry, so I figured I'll just skip that one. So I colored a few of all different sizes because I'm not going to use too many of them, but I wanted to definitely have different size flowers, and then I can put everything together. So I'm adding a little bit of the wet glue. Again, you can certainly use double-sided adhesive for this, but I'm using using the wet glue to adhere this little circle down, and then I can use that as my guide as far as where I want to place these flowers. And I kind of just messed around with it until I was happy with the placement. Some of these will be glued down flat with my wet glue, and others I'm just going to add a little bit of foam tape to them. So once I had my placement right, I will remove the ones that I will pop up with foam tape and kind of just pick these up a little bit just to add a dot of glue. That way they don't shift around. I know exactly where they need to be and they stay where they need to be. And I'm going to also add the centers, and I am going to keep the centers of these flowers white, same as for that came from the flower centers cover plate. So popped up the remaining flowers with some foam tape, and again added the centers to those. Once my flowers were all done, I went ahead and cut out the Friend die cut, but this time I only used the word itself. But in order to add even more dimension, I went ahead and cut this out 3 times, all from white cardstock, including keeping that little dot for the eye for all 3 of them. And I'm just going to glue these together. This word is large enough where it's pretty easy to glue them together and line them up. And again, you can use the double-sided adhesive before running it through your die cut machine, but using wet glue gives you that extra couple of seconds to make sure that it is completely lined up. Now you'll see one of the layers, I guess you could call it, has a little bit of ink to it, and that's simply because I used this on the Seedless Preserves ink blended panel and I didn't wash it off. So if you're ever running your die cut through onto a panel that you did some ink blending on, just take a cloth and wipe it off before using it on white cardstock, because that ink will transfer a little bit. In this case, it didn't really matter because it's going to be my base layer and nobody's going to end up seeing it anyway. So I went ahead and adhered this to the top portion of my little circle there, and wasn't sure exactly how I wanted to finish this off. I should have heat embossed the remaining part of my sentiment before I put everything together, but I didn't. So I went ahead and took 2 of the sentiments from this Friend stamp set, and I used my work surface here just to make sure that they were lined up correctly, popped those onto an acrylic block, and very, very carefully treated my card panel with an anti-static tool, stamped this with Versamark, and again, very carefully sprinkled on some white embossing powder. And you'll see that I kind of flip the panel pretty quickly so that the embossing powder doesn't stick to underneath the flowers or underneath the Friend sentiment. I went ahead and heat set that, and you do want to make sure that your heat gun is heated up for a couple of seconds, because especially we have all of this adhesive down and your heat gun is actually going to melt adhesive and your card can start falling apart. So you want to add as little heat as possible. So finished off again the card with that white Blizzard Nouveau drops, and I added this to my Friend sentiment as well as the centers of the flowers, and then just added a few more to the side just for an extra embellishment. But that is it. 2 very simple cards today. As always, I will leave the supplies listed in the description box below. Thank you guys so much for stopping by today, and have a great day. Bye.